Chapter 14 of Recollections of the Civil War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Denise Nordell. Recollections of the Civil War by Charles Dana. Chapter 14. The Great Game Between Grant and Lee. Maneuvering and Fighting in the Rain, Mud, and Thickets. Virginian Conditions of Warfare. Within 8 miles of Richmond. The Battle of Cold Harbor. The Tremendous Losses of the Campaign. The Charge of Butchery against Grant considered in the light of statistics. What it cost in life and blood to take Richmond. By the afternoon of May 17th the weather was splendid, and the roads were rapidly becoming dry, even where the mud was worst. Grant determined to engage Lee, and orders for a decisive movement of the army were issued, to be executed during the night. At first he proposed an attack upon the enemy's right, but changed the plan. Instead of attacking there, Hancock and Wright made a night march back to our right flank, and attacked at daylight upon the same lines where Hancock made his successful assault on the 12th. They succeeded in pressing close to the enemy's lines, and for a time were confident that at last they had struck the lair of the enemy, but an impassable abatis stopped them. One division of Hancock's corps attempted in vain to charge through this obstacle, and held the ground before it for an hour or more under a galling fire of canister. The difficulty of storming the enemy's entrenched camp on that side being evidently of the most extreme character, and both corps having artfully but unsuccessfully sought for a weak point where they might break through, Grant, at 9 o'clock, ordered the attack to cease. The attempt was a failure. Lee was not to be ousted, and Grant, convinced of it, issued orders for another movement, which he had had in contemplation for several days, but which he did not wish to try till after a last attempt to get the enemy out of his stronghold. This was nothing less than to slip away from Lee and march on toward Richmond again. The new order directed that Hancock's corps should march by night from its present position southeast as far toward Richmond on the line of the Fredericksburg road as he could go, fighting his way if necessary. Warren was to follow, and, if Lee did not come out and attack when our army was thus weakened, Wright and Burnside also were to march southward. This movement was begun on the night of the 20th. By the night of the 21st, Hancock was across the Mattapony River at Milford. Warren had crossed the same river at Guiney's Station, the point to which Grant had moved his headquarters. By the morning of the 22nd, Wright and Burnside were up in safety, and the forward movement was continued. We were now in a fine, clear country, good to move in and fight in, and the advance of the 22nd was most successful. By night our army lay in an east and west line along the Mattapony River, holding the crossings. On the right was Wright, close to him at the left, Warren, in the center, Burnside, on the left, Hancock. Our headquarters were at New Bethel Church. Our talk that night was that in all probability we should meet the enemy on the North Anna, a day's march to the south of our position. The operations of the next day were much embarrassed by our ignorance of the road and the entire incorrectness of our maps. Nevertheless, by 1 o'clock in the afternoon our right wing, under Warren, reached the North Anna. The stream there was about 150 feet wide, with bluff banks from 50 to 75 feet high. Wright followed after Warren. As soon as Warren reached Jericho Mills, he pushed his sharpshooters across the stream, which was easily fordable at that place, following them with a compact body of infantry. A Confederate regiment posted to watch the crossing at once gave way, leaving a single prisoner in our hands. From this man Warren learned that another of the enemy's divisions was drawn up to receive him nearby. Under the orders of General Grant, he promptly threw across the pontoon bridge, over which he rapidly moved his artillery, at the same time urging forward his infantry by the ford as well as by the bridge, and by 5 o'clock he had transported his entire command and had taken up a position of great strength. Here he rapidly commenced entrenching himself. Grant had by this time moved his headquarters up to Mount Carmel Church, some 4 miles from Jericho Mills. About 6 o'clock we knew from the firing that Warren had been attacked. I never heard more rapid or heavier firing either of artillery or musketry. It was not until about 10:30 that evening that we knew surely how the fight had gone. Then a dispatch from Warren announced that he had triumphantly repulsed the enemy and made considerable captures of prisoners. About the same time that Warren was fighting for his position at Jericho Mills, Hancock advanced on our left. By a vigorous charge of 2 brigades of Birney's division, the enemy was driven over the North Anna River. The next morning Hancock crossed over. That same morning, May 24th, we found that, as a result of the operations of the previous day, we had about 1,000 prisoners. They were more discouraged than any set of prisoners I ever saw before. Lee had deceived them, they said, and they declared that his army would not fight again except behind breastworks. The general opinion of every prominent officer in the army on the morning of the 24th was that the enemy had fallen back, either to take up a position beyond the South Anna or to go to Richmond, but by noon the next day we knew that this was a mistake. All through the day of the 24th Lee blocked our southward march. The opinion prevailed that the enemy's position was held by a rear guard only, but the obstinacy of their skirmishers was regarded as very remarkable. About dark Hancock made an attack, breaking into the Confederate line of works, taking some prisoners, and satisfying himself that a whole corps was before him. Soon afterward the division of Gibbon was attacked, but it beat back the assault handsomely, without any considerable loss. Just before dark, Crittenden, the same Crittenden who was at Chickamauga, was also suddenly attacked, and one of his brigades damaged. No fighting of any moment took place on the morning of the 25th, but the enemy showed such strength as to leave no doubt that Lee's whole army was present. His intrenchments were in the form of the letter V. He showed artillery on both faces. By the morning of the 25th, Grant was sure that Lee was before him and strongly entrenched. He soon determined on a new move. This was to withdraw his whole army as quickly as possible and, before Lee discovered his intention, to move it southeast, across the Pamunkey, and perhaps on across the Chickahominy and the James, if he could not meanwhile get Lee out of his earthworks. The orders for the new move were received with the best spirit by the army, in spite of the fact that the men were much jaded. Indeed, one of the most important results of the campaign thus far was the entire change which had taken place in the feelings of the armies. The Confederates had lost all confidence, and were already morally defeated. Our army had learned to believe that it was sure of ultimate victory. Even our officers had ceased to regard Lee as an invincible military genius. On the part of the enemy this change was evinced not only by their not attacking, even when circumstances seemed to invite it, but by the unanimous statements of prisoners taken from them. The morning after we began to move from our position on the North Anna, I was so confident that I wrote Mr. Stanton, "Rely upon it, the end is near as well as sure." It was on the night of the 26th that our army was withdrawn from the North Anna, without loss or disturbance, and by the evening of the 27th Grant had his headquarters 10 miles from Hanover Town, and his whole army was well up toward the crossing. We had no news of Lee's movements that day, though we heard that there was a force of the enemy at Hanover Courthouse. Grant himself was very doubtful that day of our getting across the Hanover Ferry. He told me that we might be obliged to go farther to the southeast to get over. On the morning of the 27th, Sheridan and his cavalry seized the ferry, laying bridges, and, after crossing, advanced well beyond. Everything went on finely that night, and during the 28th the troops passed our headquarters in great numbers and very rapidly. By noon of the 28th the movement of the army across the Pamunkey was complete, with the exception of Burnside, who did not arrive until midnight. The movement had been executed with admirable celerity and success. The new position was one of great strength, our lines extending from the Pamunkey to Totopotomoy Creek. Wright was on the Pamunkey, Hancock on his left, and Warren on the Totopotomoy. The orders for that day were to let the men rest, though both officers and men were in high spirits at the successful execution of this long and difficult flank movement. We were now south of the Pamunkey and occupying a very strong position, but we did not know yet where Lee was. A general reconnaissance was at once ordered, and the enemy was found in force south of the Totopotomoy Creek. By the 30th there was no doubt that Lee's whole army, now reinforced by 13,000 men, was close at hand and strongly entrenched again. Grant said he would fight here if there was a fair chance, but he declared emphatically he would not run his head against heavy works. Our line began to push forward on the 30th. All the afternoon of that day at headquarters, which were now at Hawes' shop, we heard the noise of fighting. First Warren on the left, who had reached a point only about 7 miles and a half from Richmond, had a short, sharp, and decisive engagement with Early, and later an active conflict raged for some time with our right on the Totopotomoy. We were successful all along the line. The next day, the 31st, we pushed ahead until our lines lay from Bethesda Church, on the east, to the railroad, on the west. Desultory firing was constantly heard, but there was no very active fighting that day until about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when Sheridan's cavalry, by hard work, drove out the enemy and secured Cold Harbor, which was at that moment of vast importance to us strategically. It was determined to make a fight here before the enemy could entrench. Wright was at once ordered to have his whole force on the ground by daylight on the 1st of June, to support Sheridan and take the offensive. Baldy Smith, of Butler's army, who had landed at White House on the 31st with 12,500 men, was ordered to the aid of Wright and Sheridan. But there was an error in Smith's orders, and Wright's march was so long that his corps did not get up to Cold Harbor until the afternoon of the 1st. Meanwhile, Sheridan's cavalry had repulsed 2 attacks by 2 brigades of Kershaw's infantry. It was not until 6 o'clock in the afternoon that we at headquarters at Bethesda Church heard the cannon which indicated that an attack had at last been made by Wright and Smith. From the sounds of artillery and musketry we judged the fight was furious. Rickett's division broke through the rebel lines between Hoke and Kershaw, capturing 500 prisoners, and forcing the enemy to take up a new position farther back. Smith's troops effected lodgments close up to the Confederate entrenchments. Our losses this day were 2,200 men in these 2 corps. Warren was slightly engaged. Together they had done very well, but meanwhile Lee was again concentrated and entrenched in our front. Hancock was ordered to move during the night, and his advance arrived at Cold Harbor about daylight. When I got up in the morning I was then at Bethesda Church his rear was marching past our headquarters. In conjunction with Wright and Smith, he was to fall upon Lee's right that day. Warren and Burnside were also ordered in as soon as they heard that the 3 corps on our left had begun battle. There was no battle that day, however. Hancock's men were so tired with their forced march of nearly 12 miles, and the heat and dust were so oppressive, that General Grant ordered the attack to be postponed until 4:30 o'clock the next morning. So the battle Grant sought did not come until June 3d, that of Cold Harbor. On the morning of the 3d our line lay with the right at Bethesda Church, the left extending to the Chickahominy. Hancock commanded the left, next to him was Wright, with his corps drawn up in 3 lines. Next, Smith, with the 18th Corps in 2 lines. Next, Warren, who had his whole command in a single line, the distance he covered being fully 3 miles. With this thin order of battle he was necessarily unable to make any effective assault. Burnside held the extreme right. Hancock, Wright, and Smith were to make the main attacks at daybreak. Promptly at the hour they dashed out toward the rebel lines under a fearful fire of musketry and a crossfire of artillery. The losses were great, but we gained advantages here and there. The entire charge consumed hardly more than an hour. Barlow, of Hancock's corps, drove through a very strong line, and at 5 o'clock reported that he had taken entrenchments with guns and colors, but he could not stay there. An interior breastwork commanded the one he had carried, and his men had to withdraw, leaving behind them the captured cannon, and bringing out a single Confederate standard and 220 prisoners as tokens of their brief success. Wright and Smith succeeded in carrying the first line of rifle pits, but could get no farther to the front. All our forces held ground close up to the enemy. At some points they were entrenched within 100 feet of the rebel breastworks. Burnside, on the right, captured some rifle pits. Later he was attacked by Early, who was roughly handled and repulsed. Warren was active and repulsed a vigorous attack by Gordon. Thus by noon we had fully developed the Confederate lines, and Grant could see what was necessary in order to get through them. Hancock reported that in his front it could not be done. Wright was decidedly of the opinion that a lodgment could be made in his front, but it would be difficult to make much by it unless Hancock and Smith could also advance. Smith thought he could carry the works before him, but was not sanguine. Burnside also thought he could get through, but Warren, who was nearest him, did not seem to share his opinion. In this state of things, at 1:30 o'clock, General Grant ordered the attack to be suspended. He had told Meade as early as 7 in the morning to suspend the movement if it became evident that success was impossible. This was the Battle of Cold Harbor, which has been exaggerated into one of the bloodiest disasters of history, a reckless, useless waste of human life. It was nothing of the kind. The outlook warranted the effort. The breaking of Lee's line meant his destruction and the collapse of the rebellion. Sheridan took the same chances at Five Forks 10 months later and won. So did Wright, Humphreys, Gibbon, and others at Petersburg. They broke through far stronger lines than those at Cold Harbor, and Lee fled in the night toward Appomattox. So it would have been at Cold Harbor if Grant had won, and who would have thought of the losses? While we lay at Cold Harbor, as when we had been at Spotsylvania, the principal topic of conversation was the losses of the army. The discussion has never ceased. There are still many persons who bitterly accuse Grant of butchery in this campaign. As a matter of fact, Grant lost fewer men in his successful effort to take Richmond and end the war than his predecessors lost in making the same attempt and failing. An official table showing the aggregate of losses sustained by the armies of McDowell, McClellan, Pope, Burnside, Hooker, Meade, Butler, and Ord in the effort to capture the Confederate capital is appended. Comparative statement of the losses sustained in action by the Army of Northeastern Virginia, the Army of the Potomac, and the Army of Virginia, under the command of Generals McDowell, McClellan, Pope, Burnside, Hooker, and Meade, from May 24, 1861 to May 4, 1864, and the Army of the Potomac, Meade, and the Army of the James, Butler and Ord, constituting the armies operating against Richmond under General Grant from May 5, 1864 to April 9, 1865. Losses from May 24, 1861 to May 4, 1864. McDowell, May 24 to August 19, 1861. Killed, 493. Wounded, 1,176. Captured or missing, 1,342. Aggregate, 3,011. McClellan, August 20, 1861 to April 4, 1862. Killed, 80. Wounded, 268. Captured or missing, 815. Aggregate, 1,163. McClellan, April 5 to August 8, 1862. Killed, 3,263. Wounded, 13,868. Captured or missing, 7,317. Aggregate, 24,448. Pope, June 26 to September 2, 1862. Killed, 2,065. Wounded, 9,908. Captured or missing, 4,982. Aggregate, 16,955. McClellan, September 3 to November 14, 1862. Killed, 2,716. Wounded, 11,979. Captured or missing, 13,882. Aggregate, 28,577. Burnside, November 15, 1862 to January 25, 1863. Killed, 1,296. Wounded, 9,642. Captured or missing, 2,276. Aggregate, 13,214. Hooker, January 26 to June 17, 1863. Killed, 1,955. Wounded, 11,160. Captured or missing, 11,912. Aggregate, 25,027. Meade, June 28, 1863 to May 4, 1864. Killed, 3,877. Wounded, 18,078. Captured or missing, 9,575. Aggregate, 31,530. Total. Killed, 15,745. Wounded, 76,079. Captured or missing, 52,101. Aggregate, 143,925. This table shows exactly what Richmond cost us from May 24, 1861, when McDowell crossed the Potomac into Virginia, to Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and it proves that Grant in 11 months secured the prize with less loss than his predecessors suffered in failing to win it during a struggle of 3 years. End of chapter 14. Recording by Denise Nordell, Modesto, California.